The antenna had been there for 11 years before anyone decided it was a problem. Walt Kowalski had erected it himself in the spring of 2013, a modest HF vertical, 42 feet of galvanized steel, anchored in a concrete footing he had poured on a Saturday morning with the methodical care of a man who had been installing telecommunications infrastructure since before most of his current neighbors were born. It was not decorative. It was not meant to be. It was a tool, built to do a specific job, and in 11 years it had done that job without complaint, without incident, and without generating a single formal objection from anyone in Crestwood Glen. Until the third Tuesday in September 2024, when the cream-colored envelope appeared in his mailbox. Walt read the violation notice at his kitchen table with the reading glasses he had acquired 2 years ago and still resented, not because they helped less than they should, but because they were evidence of something he preferred not to be evidence of. The notice was printed in a typeface attempting authority. Exterior antenna installation constitutes a visual disruption inconsistent with Crestwood Glen's community aesthetic standards and property value objectives. The installation must be removed within 30 days or the association will pursue enforcement action including financial penalties and legal remedy. He set the notice down. He picked up his coffee. He looked out the kitchen window at the antenna, silver gray in the September morning light, pointing at the sky with the unpretentious purpose of a thing that knew what it was for. Then he went to his radio room and pulled a thick 3-ring binder from the shelf. He had compiled it in 1995, when a previous HOA in a previous state had first attempted to restrict his antenna. He had updated it periodically since. It was, at this point, 340 pages, labeled in his careful engineer's hand, FCC Part 97, Amateur Radio Regulations and Preemption Doctrine. He opened it to the tab marked PRB1 and read, though he did not need to. He had read this section enough times that he could recite most of it. But he believed in reading primary sources rather than recollections of them, and this habit had served him well for 71 years. The FCC's 1985 PRB1 policy statement was unambiguous. Local regulations, including HOA rules, must reasonably accommodate amateur radio communications and could not prohibit them entirely. The 2011 declaratory ruling had strengthened this position further. The preemption doctrine was as settled as telecommunications law got. Walt had spent 35 years at the FCC helping write and enforce telecommunications law. He knew settled law. He called his daughter Renata in Minneapolis. "The HOA sent me a violation notice," he said, when she answered. "About the antenna." "Not a question." "About the antenna." "Dad." The pause of an adult child watching a parent head toward something. "How are you going to handle it?" Correctly, Walt said. "That's what I'm worried about." He smiled at the window. "I've been handling things correctly for 50 years, Renata. I'm not going to stop because someone sent me a piece of cream-colored paper. Just, please don't make enemies. You live there." "I don't make enemies," Walt said. "I make records." He drafted his response that afternoon, 2 paragraphs, certified mail, citing PRB1 and the 2011 ruling with full regulatory citations and an invitation for the HOA to identify any provision under which a lawful federal installation could be subject to local restriction. He scanned it before mailing and added a copy to a new folder on his laptop labeled CG Documentation. He had a feeling he was going to need a folder. He had moved to Crestwood Glen 3 years ago, when the Minneapolis winters had finally persuaded him that the last decades of his life could reasonably be spent somewhere that didn't require a snowblower. The community outside Denver had seemed right: 180 well-maintained homes, decent soil, a view of the mountains from the kitchen window, and neighbors who from the outside appeared to be the kind who kept to themselves in the way that was neighborly rather than hostile. He had liked it here. He had liked his radio room and his garden and the coffee he drank every morning watching the light move across the mountains and the weekly nets he ran on 225 MHz connecting amateur operators across the Front Range. He had liked being 71 and retired and free to spend his mornings the way mornings were supposed to be spent. He was a licensed amateur radio operator since 1971. Call sign W0KWL. 53 years of contacts logged in leather-bound books stacked on the shelf beside his radio, conversations with Antarctic researchers and Pacific Island operators and storm spotters and search and rescue coordinators and, once, memorably, a man in a lifeboat 60 miles off the Maine coast who had no other way to call for help. The antenna was the instrument that made all of it possible. He had grown up in Hamtramck, Michigan, the son of a Polish-American factory worker who had spent 38 years on the line at Dodge, Maine and come home every evening with the specific quietness of a man whose work did not use the parts of him that mattered most. His father had taught him to build a shortwave receiver from a kit at 16, sitting beside him at the kitchen table, patiently identifying each component, explaining each connection with the care of a man passing on something he considered genuinely important. The first evening the receiver worked, they sat together and listened to voices from across the Atlantic, a BBC broadcast, a Spanish weather station, a Norwegian fishing fleet coordinating through a relay operator. His father had listened with an expression Walt had never forgotten, the recognition that the world was larger than their circumstances had suggested, and that the tools to reach it were available to anyone willing to learn how they worked. Walt had spent the next 55 years building on that recognition. The engineering degree at Michigan Tech. The FCC career. The 35 years of regulatory work that had been, at its core, about the same thing the shortwave receiver had been about, ensuring that the spectrum, the invisible commons of human communication, remained accessible to the people it belonged to, and was not captured by those who wanted to own it. The antenna in his side yard was the latest instrument. He was not going to take it down. Sandra Vega arrived at his door on Thursday afternoon, 3 days after she would have received his certified letter, which was 2 days faster than most people took to respond to something requiring thought. She was 53, dark-haired, business casual, suggesting relaxation while communicating the opposite. She had been Crestwood Glen's HOA president for 6 years and, before that, a real estate attorney for 15. She carried a leather folio with a tablet inside, the same function as a clipboard, with fewer connotations of middle management. She looked at him when he opened the door with an expression he had learned to recognize over 71 years, the rapid recalibration of someone encountering a person older than expected in a role that older people were not typically expected to occupy aggressively. It was not contempt, exactly. It was assumption, the assumption that age was a negotiating advantage she held, that the man before her would prefer to avoid conflict, that patience and persistence would accomplish what legal argument might not. He had seen this assumption operate many times. He found it consistently instructive about the person making it. "Mr. Kowalski," she said, with a smile precisely calibrated between warmth and professional distance. "I thought it might be more productive to discuss this in person." "Come in," Walt said. He led her to the kitchen and made coffee. She sat at the table with the posture of someone accustomed to controlling rooms and uncertain whether this one was controllable. "I appreciate the thoroughness of your response," she said. "It's clear you've done some research on the regulatory framework." "I wrote FCC technical guidance documents for 22 years, Walt said. "Research is how I know things." A brief recalibration, information finding no comfortable home in her framework. She recovered quickly. "Then you understand that community standards represent a legitimate regulatory interest. A legitimate regulatory interest that yields to federal preemption when the two conflict," Walt said. "Which the FCC has clearly established they do. PRB 1 requires reasonable accommodation, not absolute permission. The question is what constitutes reasonable. The question is whether a blanket prohibition meets the reasonable accommodation standard. The FCC has been explicit that it doesn't. I have the relevant rulings if you'd like to review them." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Kowalski, I want to be direct. Please. The antenna has been there 11 years without formal objection. But community standards evolve. There are residents who feel that certain installations are," she paused, "inconsistent with the neighborhood's character." "Which residents?" "I'm not at liberty, which residents," Walt said again, without making it a question. "Because formal complaints are part of the HOA's official record and I have the right to review them under Colorado's HOA transparency statutes." She adjusted her folio. "I'll look into that process. I can send you the statutory citation," Walt offered pleasantly. She left 20 minutes later, coffee untouched. Walt added the visit to the folder and went to his radio room to run the afternoon net, 11 operators across 3 counties, 45 minutes of routine check-ins confirming equipment and frequencies were functional. Standard operations. He signed off, logged the contact, and sat in the particular silence of a radio room between transmissions. He thought about Sandra Vega's expression at the door. He had seen that expression, the recalibration from expected compliant to unexpected capable, in agency conference rooms and regulatory hearings for 35 years. It was the expression of someone who had made an assumption about what a person was capable of based on what that person appeared to be, and had discovered the assumption was wrong. In his experience, that discovery came in 2 varieties. The first kind produced genuine reconsideration. The second kind produced escalation. He was waiting to see which kind Sandra Vega was. The second violation notice arrived in October, Section 12. 1 this time, installations that may affect property values. Fine, $500. Same demand, remove the antenna within 30 days. Walt pulled out his Colorado HOA statute reference and checked the relevant provisions. He drafted a second certified letter, longer this time, citing both federal and state provisions, and added a formal request for all complaint records, all board meeting minutes discussing his antenna, and all legal correspondence related to the matter. He also called Marcus Webb, whose name he had gotten from his neighbor Phil Garza, a 74-year-old retired postal inspector 2 doors down who had mentioned Webb with the tone of someone sharing a useful resource they wished they had used sooner. Webb reviewed the folder in 48 hours. "Straightforward federal preemption," he said. "The HOA has no legitimate basis for a blanket prohibition." "I know," Walt said. "So what do you want to do?" "I want to understand what she's actually after," Walt said, "before we go to court." "Any theories?" "One," Walt said. "But I need to test it first." He had been developing the theory since early October, when he noticed something that had been visible for 18 months without registering as significant. Near the community entrance, attached to a utility pole, was a small gray metal box he had assumed was part of the HOA's security camera upgrade, mentioned in a newsletter from the previous year. He had paid it no attention. Security cameras were standard HOA infrastructure. What changed his attention was the second violation notice's timing. A lawyer who understood PRB1 preemption doctrine, and Sandra Vega clearly did not send a violation notice she knew she couldn't enforce unless the notice was achieving something the enforcement itself obscured. The question was what? He got out his spectrum analyzer, professional-grade equipment from his FCC years, retained out of habit and the conviction of a man who had spent 50 years working with the electromagnetic spectrum that the tools for understanding it were not optional. He ran a scan. The gray box was transmitting on 915 MHz. Not the short, sporadic bursts of a standard security camera. A continuous, dense data stream of the kind associated with audio monitoring equipment, the transmission signature he had seen in FCC enforcement cases involving unauthorized surveillance devices. He ran the scan 3 more times over 3 days, at different times, in different weather. The result was consistent. He checked the FCC's Universal Licensing System database, public record, searchable by any person with an internet connection. Crestwood Glen HOA held no license for any radio transmitting device. He sat with that for a long time. In his FCC career, he had worked spectrum enforcement cases involving unauthorized transmitters, pirate broadcasters, and, in the later years, unauthorized surveillance systems operating in the radio bands without proper licensing. He knew the regulatory framework precisely. A device operating the way this one appeared to be operating required specific FCC licensing unavailable to a private homeowners association. The penalties for unlicensed operation were severe, up to $100,000 per day. He also understood, now, the logic of the violation notices. His antenna was positioned on the east side of his house, facing the street. His radio room window had a direct line of sight to the gray box. His spectrum analyzer, sitting on his workbench, running its daily scans, was the only instrument within range capable of identifying what the gray box actually was. Sandra Vega had not sent him a violation notice because of his antenna's appearance. She had sent it because his antenna represented the equipment ecosystem of a man who would eventually notice her surveillance system and understand what he was seeing. She had been trying to remove the instrument before the instrument found the problem. What she had not accounted for, and what the expression at his door had confirmed she had not accounted for, was that the instrument's operator was not a compliant retiree with a hobby. He was a former federal telecommunications regulator with 35 years of spectrum enforcement experience and a binder containing 340 pages of relevant law. The assumption that age meant tractability had been, in this case, an expensive miscalculation. Walt spent the following 5 weeks building his case with the patience of a man who understood that the difference between a finding and a fact was documentation, and the difference between documentation and evidence was methodology. He continued the spectrum scans daily, logging the surveillance system's operational patterns, peak transmission hours suggesting real-time monitoring, reduced periods suggesting scheduled operation, coverage area mapping by signal strength. The system monitored 12 driveways and several residential approaches. Not just the community entrance. 12 private driveways, including his own. He pulled the HOA's financial records, publicly available under Colorado statute, and found a line item in the previous fiscal year, Community Safety Infrastructure, $43,800. No corresponding entry in the meeting minutes authorizing this expenditure, which was required for purchases above $25,000 under the HOA's own bylaws. He spoke carefully with 4 neighbors. Not about the surveillance system, not directly, not yet. About the HOA's recent activities. About the new security installations. Whether anyone had been notified about monitoring in the neighborhood. None of them had. 2 had recently received violation notices for things they considered trivial. One was Beverly Morton, 68 years old, 9 years in Crestwood Glen, a retired schoolteacher who had received notices about her wind chimes, her welcome mat, And the color of her garden hoses. 9 years I've lived here without a single problem, Beverly told him, over tea. My first notice came 4 months ago. 3 since then. She looked at her hands. I don't understand what changed. When did you speak up at a board meeting? Walt asked. Beverly looked at him. How did you know I spoke at a board meeting? Because that's the pattern, Walt said. What did you say? She had questioned the HOA's proposed landscaping contractor at the June meeting, pointing out that the contractor's rates were 40% above comparable bids she had obtained herself. Her first violation notice had arrived 19 days later. Did anyone take you seriously at the meeting? Walt asked. Beverly paused. The board chair, Sandra, she smiled at me and said she appreciated my input. And then she said that residents without professional experience in contract negotiation should be careful about making comparisons that might not account for all relevant factors. A pause. She said it very politely. Walt looked at her. She told a 68-year-old retired schoolteacher, in front of 40 people, that her judgment about numbers wasn't reliable. Beverly was quiet for a moment. When you put it that way. That's what she said, Walt said. She used professional language to say it, but that's what she said. And then 19 days later your wind chimes became a violation. Beverly's expression shifted, the specific expression of a person who has had an experience explained to them in terms that make it both clearer and more uncomfortable. I thought I was being oversensitive, she said. You were being accurate, Walt said. There's a difference. He added Beverly Morton to his folder. Phil Garza was the last conversation he needed to have, and the most important. Phil was 74, a retired postal inspector who had received his own violation notices 18 months ago and had, at some point, made a decision not to fight. Walt had been curious about that decision since Phil had mentioned Marcus Webb, the casual mention of a lawyer's name by someone who had considered using that lawyer and ultimately hadn't. He went to Phil's back porch on a Saturday afternoon in late October. Phil made coffee and they sat in the autumn air looking at Phil's garden, which was well maintained in the careful way of a man who found order therapeutic. Why didn't you fight? Walt asked, without preamble. Phil looked at his coffee. I'm 74 years old, he said. My wife has health issues. The legal process would have taken time I'm not sure I have, cost money I'd rather spend on her care, and at the end of it I'd have won something that should never have been in question. He paused. And I didn't know if I could win. I thought about it and I thought, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. Maybe an old man seeing patterns that aren't there. Were you reading too much into it? No, Phil said, without hesitation. I knew exactly what was happening. I just couldn't prove it. And I was tired. He looked at Walt. You know what that calculation feels like. I know what it feels like to understand the calculation, Walt said. I'm asking whether you think it was the right one. Phil was quiet for a long moment. A bird moved through the garden, quick and purposeful, and was gone. No, he said finally. It was the practical one. I've thought about that difference for 18 months. Practical and right aren't always the same thing, Walt said. And they're not always different things either. Your calculation had real factors in it, your wife's health, your age, your energy. Those aren't excuses. They're real. But they left it for someone else, Phil said. Yes, Walt said. They did. Phil looked at his garden. She said something to me, he said. At the meeting, when I asked about the security installation. She said, he stopped. She said that she understood residents of a certain age sometimes found new technology confusing, and that the board was happy to provide a simplified explanation if that would help. He said it flatly, without heat. In front of 20 people. Walt looked at him. I'm a retired postal inspector, Phil said. I ran fraud investigations for 22 years. I'm not confused by technology. I was asking a specific regulatory question about licensing. He paused. She answered the question I hadn't asked because the question I had asked was inconvenient. And the room let her do it, Walt said. The room let her do it, Phil agreed. Because when someone dismisses an old man's question by offering to explain things more simply, most people in the room think, well, maybe he is confused. Maybe he doesn't understand. Maybe it's age. He looked at Walt steadily. She's very good at it. She does it without malice, which makes it harder to call out. Walt nodded. This was the piece he had been missing, not the legal mechanism, which he understood completely, but the social mechanism. The way Sandra Vega maintained control not through overt aggression but through the subtle, deniable, socially acceptable dismissal of people she had categorized as past their useful authority. Older residents, retired residents, people without current professional credentials that commanded automatic respect in a room. She managed them with patience and condescension, in equal measure, And the combination was effective because each element was individually defensible. "What do you need from me?" Phil asked. "Whatever you kept," Walt said. Phil went inside and came back with a manila envelope. Inside was 14 months of violation notices, 2 letters from HOA legal counsel, and a handwritten log of dates and events, the systematic record of a retired postal inspector who understood evidence even when he hadn't decided what to do with it. "I thought I was being paranoid," Phil said. "Keeping all this." "You were being accurate," Walt said. "Again, there's a difference." Phil looked at him. "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true," Walt said. The storm arrived on a Thursday in November. Walt had been tracking it since Tuesday, monitoring the amateur radio emergency nets where mountain spotters were reporting conditions that the official forecast was underweighting. By Wednesday evening he had his radio room on full emergency configuration, 200 amp-hour lithium backup power, emergency frequencies pre-programmed, his contact list for Jefferson County Emergency Management confirmed and current, his logbooks open to fresh pages. By 4 in the afternoon Thursday, the power was out across most of Jefferson County. Wind gusting to 72 miles per hour. The cellular network, overloaded by 10,000 simultaneous users trying to reach 10,000 other simultaneous users, had degraded to functional uselessness. Landlines were intermittent. The county's digital emergency dispatch system was running on backup power and triaging. At 4:15, Walt keyed his microphone on the Colorado Emergency Amateur Radio Service net frequency, 147.330 MHz, and announced that W0KWL was operational and available for traffic. The first call came at 4:40. A woman on the north side of Crestwood Glen, voice taut with controlled panic, her mother had fallen, possibly broken her hip, couldn't reach 911 because every attempt went to a busy signal. Walt took her address, relayed it to Jefferson County EMS through the amateur radio net, confirmed receipt, and told her to keep the line, his line, open. Paramedics arrived 37 minutes later. The delay was from road conditions, not communications. Walt logged the contact: 4:40 p.m., medical relay, elderly fall, 8 Maplewood Court. EMS response confirmed 5:17 p.m. The second came at 5:15, a neighbor 2 streets over, basement flooding from a drainage backup, asking about emergency water diversion procedures. Walt connected him to a county emergency management coordinator who walked him through the process. 30 minutes of conversation. No property lost. At 5:40, a transmission from an operator Walt didn't recognize, elderly male voice, equipment clearly unfamiliar to the user, signal fluctuating as if the microphone was being held at varying distances. "I'm trying, my neighbor showed me how to do this. There's a tree down across the power lines on Birchwood Avenue and the lines are on the ground and there are sparks." Walt took the location, relayed immediately to Jefferson County Utilities emergency line through the net, confirmed a crew was dispatched. He stayed with the man, whose name was Gerald, who was 81 years old and had borrowed his neighbor's emergency radio specifically for situations like this, though he had never used one before, for 20 minutes, talking him through the wait, keeping him calm, explaining what the utility crew would do when they arrived. "You did exactly right," Walt told him, when Gerald confirmed the utility crew had arrived and secured the lines. "You used the equipment correctly." "I was scared I'd do it wrong," Gerald said. "My son keeps saying I'm too old to be alone in a storm." "Your son is wrong," Walt said. "You handled an emergency correctly. Log that." Gerald laughed, surprised and genuine. "I'll tell him you said so." At 6:20, a family on Ridgecrest Court with a 3-year-old running a fever of 104, parents unable to reach their pediatrician's emergency line, asking whether the urgent care on Route 6 was open and accessible given the road conditions. Walt worked 3 relays simultaneously: the urgent care's direct line, a county road condition update, and a neighbor with a truck who could drive them, and had an answer back in 11 minutes. The child's fever broke by midnight. Walt didn't know this until the mother called his landline 2 days later to tell him. Between 4:15 and midnight, he handled 43 traffic relays. Medical emergencies. Welfare checks on elderly residents who lived alone and hadn't been heard from. Utility hazard reports. Requests for shelter information from people who had lost heat. A carbon monoxide alarm in a house where the occupants had sealed the windows against the wind and the backup generator was running in an attached garage. That one, relay number 31, logged at 9:52 p.m., CO alarm, 23 Ridgecrest Court, 4 occupants including 2 children. Relayed to fire emergency net. Response confirmed 10:14 p.m. Occupants evacuated, treated, no casualties. Walt sat with that entry for a moment after writing it. 22 minutes. In carbon monoxide situations, 22 minutes was the difference between discomfort and brain damage. He drank water from his thermos and kept working. At 8:47, a transmission came in on a frequency he had not been monitoring, someone operating on 146. 520 MHz, the national simplex calling frequency, with the hesitant technique of a person who knew the frequency existed but had never used it. This is, I don't know the proper procedure, but I need help. I'm at 14 Birchwood Circle. My husband has chest pain radiating to his left arm and I can't get through to 911 and, Walt recognized the address before he recognized the voice. 14 Birchwood Circle was Sandra Vega's house. He keyed his microphone. Calm, precise, the voice of someone who had done this many times. This is W0KWL. I have you clearly. Describe your husband's current condition. A pause, less than a second, but he heard what was in it. He's conscious. Chest pain started 40 minutes ago, radiating to the left arm and jaw. He's 58, no prior cardiac history. He's sweating and his color is W0KWL to Jefferson County EMS net, priority medical traffic, suspected acute ME, 14 Birchwood Circle, Crestwood Glen. He relayed the address, the symptoms, the patient's age and history, the access road conditions, the nearest clear approach. He had given this information in this order so many times that it came out fully formed, with no hesitation, covering every detail a paramedic needed to prepare before arrival. He maintained contact with Sandra while the relay completed, keeping her talking, keeping her focused, monitoring her husband's condition for any change that would require updating the EMS relay. Has he lost consciousness? No. He says the pain is, he says it's moving. That's common. Keep him still. Don't let him exert himself. Is he on any blood thinners? No. Nothing. Good. EMS has your location and they're coming. Talk to me about your house. What's the easiest access? Front door, side door? Front door. The walkway is clear. I'm telling them front door. He relayed the update. They're coming. Stay on frequency. Paramedics arrived at 14 Birchwood Circle 19 minutes after Walt's initial relay. Sandra's husband, his name was David, Walt learned later, 58 years old, a civil engineer who coached youth soccer on weekends, was transported to St. Anthony's with a confirmed acute ME. He survived. The cardiac team at St. Anthony's told Sandra afterward that the response time had been critical, that the gap between symptom onset and intervention had been narrow, and that the outcome at the narrower end of that gap was substantially better than the outcome at the wider end. The gap had been 19 minutes. It had been 19 minutes because of the antenna. Walt logged the contact at 9:03 p.m. and returned to the net. He worked until 12:30, when the cellular network began recovering and the emergency volume dropped. He signed off, secured his equipment, and sat in his radio room in the dark. 47 relays. 3 situations: Gerald and the power lines, the carbon monoxide family, David Vega's cardiac event, where the communication timing had been the material difference between good outcomes and worse ones. And 37 other situations where frightened people in a dark, stormy neighborhood had needed to reach someone who could help them, and had been able to, because a 71-year-old man with an old antenna and 53 years of practice had been ready when readiness was required. He did not feel triumphant. He felt what he had always felt after emergency operations, a clean, uncomplicated satisfaction. The tool had functioned correctly. The operator had done his job. The work had been what the work was supposed to be. He thought about his father at the shortwave receiver, listening to voices from across the Atlantic. The recognition that the world was larger than circumstances suggested, and that the tools to reach it were available to anyone willing to learn how they worked. He closed his logbook and went to bed. Sandra Vega came to his door at 10 the following morning. She looked different from her previous visits, the professional calibration present but reorganized around something that had shifted. Hospital waiting rooms did particular things to a person's relationship with performance. She had spent the night in one, and it showed, and she was not pretending otherwise. David is stable, she said, at the door. The doctors say he'll make a full recovery. I'm glad, Walt said. Come in. He made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table and this time she drank it, both hands around the mug, in the way of someone who needed something solid. They sat in silence for a moment. Walt waited, because the person who had come to say something should be allowed to find their way to it. I owe you a great deal, she said finally. You owe the amateur radio service a great deal, Walt said. I'm a part of it. You're the part that was here. She looked at her coffee. They told me at the hospital, the doctor specifically said that early intervention made a significant difference. That the response time was, she stopped. That it mattered. It usually does, Walt said. Another silence. She was working toward something, and he let her work. I've been practicing law for 22 years, she said. I understand preemption doctrine. I knew when I sent the first violation notice that the federal argument was strong. She met his eyes. I sent it anyway. Walt looked at her steadily. The surveillance system, she said. I knew your equipment could detect it. I knew your radio room faced the utility pole. I thought, she stopped. I thought if you were gone, the problem would be gone. I thought you would take the notices and comply, because, she stopped again. Because I was old, Walt said. The directness of it made her flinch, briefly. Because most residents, when they receive violation notices, find it easier to comply than to fight. And I thought, she looked at her hands. I thought someone who spent their retirement operating a radio in their spare room would not have the background or the energy to know what you were doing, Walt said. Yes, she said, quietly. I wrote FCC enforcement guidance for 22 years, Walt said. I've worked more spectrum enforcement cases than you've sent violation notices. He paused. The assumption that retirement means diminishment is a common one. It's not accurate. She received this without deflection. No, she said. It's not. He let that sit for a moment. Then, tell me about the surveillance system. What were you trying to accomplish? She explained. She had been concerned, for 2 years, about a pattern of after-hours vandalism in the neighborhood, 3 incidents in 18 months, no perpetrator identified, minimal police engagement. She had installed the monitoring system as a genuine security response. The implementation choices, ISM band, audio rather than video, no resident notification, no FCC licensing, had been made by the contractor she hired, who had assured her the system was compliant. She had not verified that assurance. When Phil Garza asked about it at the board meeting, she said, I realized the licensing might be an issue. I looked into it and confirmed it was an issue. And instead of fixing the problem, I tried to remove the person who had noticed it, Walt said. Yes, Sandra said. And when I pushed back instead of complying, the violations escalated. Yes. And Beverly Morton, who questioned the landscaping contractor, Sandra's jaw tightened, very slightly. That was, she stopped. That was also wrong. She asked a legitimate question and I dismissed it in a way that was, I told myself I was managing the meeting. I was doing something else. You were telling a 68-year-old woman, in front of 40 people, that her judgment about numbers couldn't be trusted because she lacked professional experience, Walt said. That's what you were doing. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. That's what I was doing. He looked at her with the patient attention of a man who had learned, over 71 years, that the most important question was not what a person had done but what they understood about what they had done. It was the question that determined what came next. She understood what she had done. That was, in his experience, not nothing. Here is what I want, he said. The violation notices withdrawn and the enforcement action closed. The surveillance system decommissioned or properly licensed and disclosed to all affected residents, with an explanation to the community of what it is, how long it's been operating, and what data it's collected. The HOA board adopts a formal emergency communications protocol recognizing amateur radio operators as a community emergency resource. Beverly Morton's violation notices reviewed and withdrawn. And Phil Garza receives a written acknowledgement that his question at the board meeting was legitimate and appropriate. Sandra looked at him. The acknowledgement to Phil, that's specific. Phil Garza ran fraud investigations for 22 years, Walt said. He asked a specific regulatory question and was told, in front of his neighbors, that he was confused by technology. He deserves a specific correction. She was quiet for a moment. I'll need to involve the board. Of course, Walt said. The board should be involved. These are community decisions. She stood up to leave. At the door she paused, and turned back, and said something he had not expected. When I came to your door in September, she said. The first time. You knew, didn't you? What I was actually doing. Walt looked at her. I knew the enforcement rationale was pretextual, he said. A lawyer who understands preemption doctrine doesn't send an unenforceable violation notice unless the notice is achieving something the enforcement doesn't. I didn't know what the something was yet. I found out. How long did it take? 3 weeks to identify the surveillance system. 6 weeks to document it adequately. He paused. You gave me time by sending violation notices through formal channels. Formal channels create paper. Paper creates records. Records are what I work with. Sandra looked at him for a moment, not quite the expression of defeat, not quite respect, something between them that had no precise name but was honest. I underestimated you, she said. Yes, Walt said. You did. She went out into the November morning. Walt stood in his doorway and watched her car pull away. Then he looked at his antenna. Silver gray in the morning light. 42 feet of galvanized steel pointing at the sky, exactly as it had for 11 years. He went back inside and keyed up on the morning net. W0KWL, Crestwood Glen, checking in. Equipment fully operational. Frequency clear. He logged the contact and made a fresh pot of coffee. The December board meeting ran for 3 hours. Walt arrived 10 minutes early and sat in the second row with a folder containing 7 documents in the order he would need them. He had not prepared a speech. He had prepared facts, and facts in his experience were their own argument when presented accurately. Beverly Morton was in the third row, the composed posture of someone who had decided to be present without deciding what being present would require. Phil Garza was in the back, wearing the expression of a man who had come to see something and had not yet determined his role in it. 3 residents from the street where Walt had handled the carbon monoxide relay were sitting together on the left, with the specific attentiveness of people who now understood what the evening was about. Sandra Vega opened the meeting at 7. She moved through the preliminary items with efficiency, and when she reached W0KWL Antenna Matter and Community Safety Review, she looked at Walt. "Mr. Kowalski, you've been given time to address the board." Walt stood. He did not use notes. "Thank you. I want to start with context that isn't in my documentation folder, because it isn't a regulatory fact, it's an observation about how things work." The room was quiet. "I'm 71 years old. I've been a licensed amateur radio operator for 53 years and a federal telecommunications regulator for 35. In my experience, amateur radio operators are consistently treated in HOA communities as hobbyists, older people, mostly, with technical interests that look unfamiliar and therefore threatening to community aesthetics. We get violation notices. We get told our equipment is an eyesore. And we get managed, sometimes overtly, sometimes through more subtle means, toward compliance, because the assumption is that older residents who spend their retirement on a technical hobby lack either the knowledge or the energy to push back effectively." He paused, and looked at the room. "Last Thursday night, this community lost power, cellular communications, and landline redundancy simultaneously for 8 hours, in a storm that produced 3 medical emergencies, 1 carbon monoxide event, 1 downed power line, and 43 separate requests for emergency assistance. Every one of those situations was handled through the amateur radio installation that your HOA told me to remove." He let that sit for a moment. The assumption that a 71-year-old man running a radio in his spare room was an aesthetic problem rather than an emergency resource was, in the outcome, incorrect. He set his first document on the table. "This is my request for withdrawal of both violation notices, closure of the enforcement action, and adoption of an emergency communications protocol. The second document is a draft protocol, prepared with Jefferson County Emergency Management." He set the second document down. "I also want to address the community surveillance system." He walked through the spectrum analysis, the licensing violation, the coverage area, the 18 months of undisclosed operation. He did it precisely, without drama, the way he had presented findings in agency hearings for 35 years, letting the facts create their own weight, not adding to it artificially. The room received it in the held breath of people whose picture of something they'd trusted has just changed shape. Then it exhaled. The questions that followed lasted 2 hours. They were directed at Sandra, and then at the board, and then, gradually, at each other, in the way communities process the discovery that something they believed was functioning correctly has not been. Sandra answered them. All of them, with more directness than Walt had expected and less defensiveness than the room had anticipated. She acknowledged the licensing failure. She acknowledged the notification failure. She acknowledged that the board had not properly authorized the expenditure. She acknowledged the pattern of violation notices that had preceded residents' complaints at board meetings. "The monitoring system will be decommissioned by the end of the month," she said. "We'll work with Mr. Kowalski and Jefferson County Emergency Management on the emergency communications protocol. We'll conduct a full review of violation notices issued in the past 18 months for compliance with our own standards." She paused. "And I want to acknowledge something specifically." She looked at Phil Garza in the back row. "At a board meeting last spring, Mr. Garza asked a regulatory question about our security installation that was specific, relevant, and legitimate. I responded by suggesting he might be confused about the technology involved. That response was inaccurate and disrespectful, and it was a way of dismissing a valid question that I didn't want to answer directly." She held Phil's eyes. "I apologize for that. The question was right. My answer was wrong." Phil Garza sat in the back row of the Crestwood Glen community room and received this with the stillness of a man absorbing something he had waited 18 months to hear. He did not respond immediately. He nodded, once, slowly, with the dignity of a person accepting an acknowledgement that should not have been necessary but was, given that it was necessary, at least real. Beverly Morton raised her hand. "What about my violation notices?" "Under review and will be withdrawn," Sandra said. "All 4 of them." Beverly lowered her hand. Walt watched her face, the specific expression of a person being told that what they experienced was real and was wrong, and beginning to decide what to do with that confirmation. Not triumph. Not relief, exactly. Something quieter and more durable than either. The board voted unanimously to adopt the Emergency Communications Protocol, decommission the surveillance system, and establish an independent review of all violation notices issued in the past 2 years. The meeting ended at 10:15. In the parking lot, Phil Garza found Walt. "Well," Phil said. "Well," Walt said. Phil looked at the sky, clear and cold after the storm had cleaned the air, stars visible in a way they only were after big weather. "She apologized," he said. "I didn't expect that." "She understood what she'd done," Walt said. "That's not common. Give it credit." "I'm trying to." Phil was quiet for a moment. "My wife asked me last night whether I was going to the meeting. I said I didn't know. She said," he stopped. Then continued. "She said the way you handled this, the documentation, the spectrum analysis, the patience, she said it reminded her of why she married me. Because I used to be that kind of person. Someone who paid that kind of attention." He paused. "She said she missed that person." Walt looked at him. "She said she thought he was still in there," Phil said. "Is he?" Walt asked. Phil looked at the stars. "He came to the meeting," he said. "That's a start," Walt said. "What comes next is up to you." Phil nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "I think I've known for 18 months. I just needed," he stopped. "Someone to ask," Walt said. "Yes," Phil said. "Someone to ask." They said good night. Walt drove home through the Colorado winter, parked in his driveway, got out, and stood for a moment in the cold looking at his house. The radio room window was lit. He had left the equipment on standby, as he did every night, in case someone needed to reach him. He looked at his antenna. Exactly as it had always been. Silver gray, 42 feet, pointing at the sky. The air around it was full of signals, voices and data and the electromagnetic signature of 8 million people doing their constant invisible reaching toward each other across distance. He had been listening to that reaching for 53 years, had built the instruments to hear it and maintained the skills to understand it and defended the right to access it when people who didn't understand its value had tried to take it away. He thought about his father beside him at the shortwave receiver, the expression on his face when the first Atlantic voice came through the static, the recognition that the world was larger than their circumstances had suggested, and that the tools to reach it were available to anyone willing to learn how they worked. Anyone. Not the young or the credentialed or the conventionally capable. Anyone willing to learn. He thought about Gerald at 81, borrowing a neighbor's radio and using it correctly in an emergency, and the son who thought Gerald was too old to be alone in a storm. He thought about Beverly Morton and her wind chimes, about Phil Garza's manila envelope, kept for 18 months because a retired postal inspector understood evidence even when he hadn't decided what to do with it. About the 47 relays on a Thursday night in November, each one a thread of human reaching from someone frightened and isolated towards someone ready to receive. He thought about what it meant to be ready. Not young, not in the prime of professional credentialing, not performing capability for rooms that measured it by age. Simply ready, equipped, practiced, present, and willing to be useful to whoever needed it, including the person who had been trying to take away the instrument. He went inside. He sat at his radio desk and opened his logbook to a fresh page, wrote the date in his careful engineer's hand, and recorded the day's events with the completeness he brought to every entry: the board meeting, the vote, Sandra's acknowledgement, Phil's conversation, the parking lot stars. He wrote it precisely and without embellishment, because completeness was how a record became true, and true records were what endured. Then he turned on his radio, adjusted his frequency to the evening net, and listened. The spectrum was clear. Somewhere across the Front Range, an operator was calling CQ, the universal invitation, unchanged since the first days of wireless: "I am here. Is anyone there? I am ready to connect." Walt picked up his microphone. "W0KWL, he said. "I'm here." He logged the contact. He was always the first to answer. In January, Jefferson County Emergency Management formally recognized Crestwood Glen as the county's 16th designated emergency communications node. Walt was asked to present at the county's annual Emergency Preparedness Conference in March, his topic: the role of amateur radio infrastructure in residential communities, and the regulatory framework protecting it. He accepted. The surveillance system was decommissioned on December 28. Every resident on the 12 affected driveways received a written notification explaining what the system had been, how long it had operated, and what data it had collected. 3 residents requested their data under Colorado privacy statute. They received it. Beverly Morton's 4 violation notices were withdrawn. She kept her wind chimes. At the January Garden Committee meeting, she proposed a community emergency preparedness subcommittee. The motion passed with no dissenting votes. Phil Garza attended the February Amateur Radio Club meeting at Walt's kitchen table, 8 operators, coffee, technical discussion of emergency antenna deployment. He sat in the corner and listened for 2 hours without saying much. At the end, when people were putting on their coats,